publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. So before diving into my study, I will briefly outline the typical stages of building a research project. We usually start with identifying a knowledge gap, and this is crucial because you want to research something novel, something that hasn't been done yet, especially if you want it to be meaningful and also publish the research at the end. And from there, we formulate questions that target this knowledge gap, design a suitable methodology, gather and analyze data, and finally, of course, write everything up and publish. And now I will guide you through how each of these steps played out in my research journey. So as I have mentioned previously, my research agenda focuses on the pharmacological management of Parkinson's disease. And my research journey began with two systematic reviews of the literature, so existing literature, especially clinical trials. And one of them was on a drug called ND0612, which is a form of a common medication, levodopa-carbidopa, for Parkinson's disease. And the other one was rasagiline, which is another type of inhibitor for Parkinson's disease. And both of them are used to treat the symptoms of the disease because Parkinson's is not curable. And these reviews were informative in a way, but they were very frustrating. And the biggest limitation that I encountered here was a lack of access to complete clinical trial data. And this made it hard to determine the full therapeutic potential of these medications. And this limitation actually made me wonder, if we do not have access to complete clinical trial data, do patients and their practitioners know all the possible Parkinson's disease medications? So do they have knowledge of them? And this is when I realized that the problem of lacking complete clinical trial data also might lead to a lack of knowledge about existing medication options among both patients and even practitioners, which in turn might lead to barriers in decision-making about certain treatment plans for individual patients. And of course, this involves the shared decision-making process that they're making with their doctors, with their practitioners. And so this is how I identified my knowledge gap. And as you see, often these knowledge gaps, they will come from previous studies that you're doing. Either they are actual already research, like original research, such as your own survey studies or something like that. Or it can be like it was in my case, where I did a systematic map of an existing literature and realized that we have this gap, which can potentially lead to much bigger problems in clinical practice. And building on this realization of the knowledge gap, I started drafting ideas for my study. So if we don't have clinical trial data, or if it's not accessible and results are underreported, then maybe patients and practitioners simply don't know what options are out there in the market for Parkinson's disease. And I realized that in this study, I wanted to assess real-world knowledge. So not just for one medication, but of the full spectrum of pharmacological options for Parkinson's. And of course, I wanted to see if socio-demographic variables such as education or age or ethnicity influence this knowledge that patients and practitioners have. And the next brick in the foundation was to clearly define research questions. And a good research question is specific, feasible, and it is rooted in existing evidence gaps. So my primary question was, what is the knowledge that patients and practitioners have regarding pharmacological management options for Parkinson's disease? And the second question explored whether the knowledge was influenced by socio-demographic variables such as education, age, ethnicity, and geographic location. And this helped me set the direction for my study design, so for my methodology, because without these research questions, I was not able to actually design my study till the end and be able to write down my methods. So for choosing the methodology, so based on the research questions, I realized that I want to use an existing model for a survey, which would mean that I would get more validated and reliable results. I used the knowledge attitude practice known as the CAP model. And I adapted it to develop a questionnaire that would assess patient and practitioner knowledge of pharmacological management options for Parkinson's. So I still use the same model of this validated survey instrument, but I adapted it to mostly focus on the knowledge of the pharmacological options and, of course, specifically for my case, which was pharmacological options for Parkinson's. And as I already mentioned, the CAP model is a valid instrument that assesses what people know, how they feel, and how they behave regarding a specific health topic. And in my case, it was actually focusing so what these people actually know. And why it is important to use a validated or valid instrument, it's because it has been done before. So somebody else has used this in, of course, maybe a different area. But this means that the survey questions are valid, so they're working. And this is why it's important. Otherwise, if you want to develop a questionnaire from scratch, most of the time you will have to first validate it and run a study on it and see how it would actually work in the real practice before you do it in your certain research. Because as we mentioned also in a previous lecture, if you have a badly designed survey, even if you get a lot of responses from a lot of people, it will create a lot of garbage data that you will not be able to use or analyze. This is why it's important that every survey is thought through, validated, and it collects reliable data. And in my case, the questionnaire consisted of 11 questions and it included 4 sections. So first I collected socio-demographic data. Then I collected patient or practitioner knowledge of both pharmacological and non-pharmacological management options. And later, of course, I divided these up. So I analyzed only the pharmacological data and the non-pharmacological. Then I also collected some data on patient or practitioner attitude towards trying or prescribing new emerging pharmacological management options. And lastly, patient or practitioner attitude towards using pharmacological and non-pharmacological management options or their combination in the management of Parkinson's. And so far, I have published a study on the pharmacological management options where I mainly analyze the knowledge. I also published an online first article for the non-pharmacological knowledge. But as for the attitude, so far I have not started analyzing the data, writing up the paper, but it's actually planned for the future. So you can see that even from one survey, I can develop multiple research papers because of the amount of data I was able to collect in this survey. And what's important for this specific example and for the paper I published is the second section where I collected the pharmacological management option knowledge. And I selected, so I put down the medications in boxes where each patient and practitioner was able to check which options they are aware of. So which options do they know? And I also put a little blank on the bottom where they could pick other and write down a non-listed management option. And why this other field was important was because even though I listed those medications, I listed them by their scientific name. So either it was levodopa or rasagiline or selagiline. But as you know, drugs are often marketed under different names. So I gave the opportunity for the people to write down, for example, name of a drug. And then I looked it up and I found that that means that they know the certain medication that I had listed originally. And this is why it's also important to think about these details beforehand. And you need to think that the person on the other side of the survey who's responding to it is not always a researcher or a scientist or a doctor. In this case, I also had this patient population, and this is why it was important to think that they're also able to write down, for example, a drug name that they see on their drug box at home. And as I already mentioned, I also collected non-pharmacological option data, and I split the results up in 2 separate papers. But today we're talking about the pharmacological one. And to make the study inclusive, I translated the survey into English, Latvian, and German. You might wonder why specifically this. Well, English, obviously, because most of my participants were globally, especially in the United States. Latvian, it's because it's my home country, Latvia, and it was important for me to try to reach those respondents from there as well. And I currently reside in Germany and wanted to recruit some participants here as well, which is why I also translated it into German. So as you see, I wanted to collect a bigger sample, and I was successful in collecting quite a big sample for the study. And this was mainly possible because I offer the survey in 3 different languages. I also kept the wording plain and accessible, especially for the patient population. As you know, not everybody has the scientific or research education. And of course, I also provided paper forms for those with limited digital access, especially older adults who may struggle to use technology. And this was also key to maximizing the representativeness of my sample. So I had this, for example, paper survey for these older adults, so I don't exclude like patients who are maybe over 80 years of age or at the older spectrum. So I have generalizable data. And when it comes to recruitment and sampling, I reached out to Parkinson's disease support groups, hospitals, and wellness programs, mainly using email and also printed flyers that had QR codes on them. So if somebody was using a phone or an iPad to take the survey, they could just scan the code and get to the link immediately. I, of course, also leverage my professional networks, especially for practitioners. I reached out to a lot of doctors and therapists through LinkedIn or Facebook groups, specifically meant for doctors. And my aim generally was to collect data from both patients and practitioners worldwide and to reach as many as possible. What I already have understood from this study and from another one I'm doing right now is that patients are generally more responsive than doctors or any type of practitioner. And I think it's because patients, of course, have this personal will to collaborate and do something to eventually make Parkinson's care better. And of course, professionals such as practitioners and doctors are very busy with a lot of tasks, a lot of patients. So it might be the reason why their response rates are a little bit lower. In the end, I recruited 641 participants, and all of these responses were full because I collected for this survey, I collected only fully recorded responses. And this was exceeding the 385 that I needed for my zero point 0.8 power. Like we talked about last time, to have a powered study, you have the zero point 0.8 power. And in this case, I calculated it would have to be 385, but I got 641, which is really good because the bigger sample you have, the better analysis you can make out of it. And of course, I followed all ethical procedures for the study. I obtained institutional review board approval, which is like an ethics approval, prior to participant recruitment. And I ensured that all participants provided informed consent. You've often heard of informed consent in clinical trial settings, and this is also the case in survey research. We might not think about it every day, but if a person is giving out their responses, no matter if it's their demographic data, even if the survey is anonymous, we need to obtain consent that they are entirely sure what they're doing and that they want to participate voluntarily in our study. So this, I applied for the IRB approval. I received it. I had to like send them all of my recruitment materials, all the email templates I'm going to send out to patients, practitioners. Of course, the survey, the informed consent form at the beginning of the survey. And then they made some suggestions, which I then fixed, and the approval was granted. And this has to be done every time we do a study like this. I also had anonymized data, so I had no patient data collected. I don't know the patient names or also the practitioner, so any participant. I don't know their email addresses. I don't even know their IP address, so everything is anonymous. And I also made sure that the paper responses were securely stored and they were digitized without identifiers. So some of the paper responses I got were sent through the Parkinson's support groups, where the main person who leads the group had those people do the survey. It was also anonymous on paper, and then she scanned them in and sent them to me all in one go. So I had no idea which patient responded to which paper survey either. And a really important step after you have gotten your data is actually the data cleaning and preparation. This can take a lot of your time. For me, it was the first time because this was my first survey study. So I manually checked the data for any input errors or inconsistencies before the analysis. I also try to identify if there are no like double responses. For example, if somebody went in the survey, did it, and then somehow at the same time did it again. So if I had overlapping like responses are exactly the same and the survey time was the same, then I would look for these duplicates, so to say. And as for inconsistencies, I would look for really fast survey answering. So if normally it would take 10 to 15 minutes, maybe for some it takes 7. But if I saw that somebody took a minute to fill out the survey, then that was a red flag that probably they had just clicked through it without even thinking of the responses and if their answers are correct. And as I said, then only fully completed surveys were included in this analysis. And this ensured a clean data set that is ready for statistical analysis in a statistical software. And I used Stata 18 for my data analysis. I usually do that, but of course you can also use SPSS or any other software. And first I started with descriptive statistics to describe my sample. And then I used the chi-square tests to identify sociodemographic differences between patient and practitioners. Then I used Spearman's correlations to assess the relationship between sociodemographic variables and the number of pharmacological management options identified as having knowledge of. And then I use simple logistic regression to compare patient and practitioner knowledge of each individual pharmacological management option. And then multiple logistic regression to compare patient and practitioner knowledge of each individual pharmacological management option while controlling for sociodemographic variables that could influence the outcome of the knowledge. And my results showed that practitioners were more likely to have knowledge than patients of almost all pharmacological options. And I have to say that this was not surprising to me. I had hypothesized that it would be that way because most of my practitioner group, I assume, would have been practitioners who actually work with pharmacological options. Although I did include also physical therapists, speech therapists, and other types of practitioners. But either way, I had a feeling that they would be more knowledgeable than patients because patients often are prescribed a certain medication by their doctor, and they're taking it, and they don't really seek knowledge of these options by themselves. And levodopa-carbidopa, which is the standard treatment for Parkinson's disease, was most known. And a drug called procyclidine was the least known. And levodopa-carbidopa, again, was not surprising to me, especially there are different types. There are certain different types of oral forms of it, one that gets immediate release to your bloodstream and one that's extended release. And there's also different types of pumps and intestinal gels. So these are the most known and also most prescribed, whereas drugs like procyclidine, I hadn't heard of it before the survey study as well. So it is clear why it was least known. And knowledge was, of course, significantly associated with education level, age, and geographical location of my participants. Again, I think the education level is quite let's say, understandable because also practitioners who have a higher education level, that means that they have gone through their medical school and they probably also have more experience in prescribing medications. And as well, that would make sense for patients because a lot of times patients who have a higher education level seek more of their own knowledge and try to do some research of their own, not just rely purely on their practitioner knowledge and expertise. And after the data analysis, I structured my manuscript to follow a publishable format. Here, it's important to identify a target journal. Every journal, if you have already maybe looked into publishing or if you will, every journal has a different format and a different author guidelines or different requirements. So you really need to pay attention to that, especially, for example, when it comes to references and referencing. Every journal can use a different style. Some might use APA, some use AMA, some use Harvard, or something completely different. And they also can suggest how you have to structure your manuscript. Most of the time you follow the usual, which is an abstract introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. But there might be some subpoints that some journals have more specific than others. And I focused the paper on the knowledge gap between patients and practitioners. And since those with lower education levels were less likely to have knowledge of pharmacological management options, I focused a lot of my discussion around that and trying to show what could be done in clinical practice to improve this for people with lower education levels. And yeah, in my discussion, I talked a lot about the clinical relevance of this and focusing also on patients' health literacy. So those with lower education levels may have lower health literacy. And I recommended improved education to patients to improve their health literacy. And of course, in that way, also the knowledge of pharmacological management options for Parkinson's disease. And in my opinion, this could also apply to a broader range of diseases, of course, not just Parkinson's. And now I will talk about writing the different parts of a manuscript. So first, we're going to start with the introduction. This can be tricky, and even though it might be good to write the introduction first, I sometimes still return to fix the introduction once I have written my methodology and results sections. And this is completely normal because sometimes you may come up with another statistical test you're going to run already after you ran some tests and wrote a part of your results, and that is completely normal to return and introduce it again in the introduction. So in paragraph 1, I started by framing the importance of pharmacological management in Parkinson's disease. So why is this a broader problem and why it's important? And I also introduced major medication classes such as levodopa, monoamine oxidase B inhibitors, dopamine agonists, and I connected them directly to the core symptoms of Parkinson's, which are both motor and non-motor symptoms. So as you can see, I started a little bit broader. So if I'm looking at pharmacological treatments and I'm looking at Parkinson's disease, then that's what I start with. I start with the big picture and the big problem, so to say. And sometimes you will see that this is the hook of your paper, your first paragraph, because it's telling the reader that this is a high impact area where you've identified a certain knowledge gap. And these knowledge gaps can affect real patient lives. So it's not just something you're doing on paper, but it actually has clinical relevance. Then further, I expanded on why pharmacological management is not straightforward. And I explained that complications emerge over time and every patient is individual. And I think this applies to every therapeutic area, not just Parkinson's disease, but there's a lot of variation across individuals in certain symptoms that they're experiencing and how their disease progresses. So this is why it's also important why we know a wider range of medications, not just give one to all the patients. And paragraphs 3 and 4 already went deeper. I broke down certain biological and non-biological factors that can influence disease progression and treatment outcomes. And in my case, that was certain genotypes, so genetics in Parkinson's disease, also having comorbidities such as diabetes, and of course also health system disparities, which was also important why I collected geographical location in my survey. So there are often regional treatment differences, especially across different countries and continents. And we have practitioner biases and even cultural perceptions of aging and disease. And of course, this also served two purposes because it showed that I've done a thorough literature review and I'm also looking at sociodemographic variation as a central theme, which is very, very popular in research studies these days because we see more and more that we have disparities across different sociodemographics. And then I had a fifth paragraph where I said the practical issue, which is that many patients and their practitioners might not even be aware of all the treatment options for Parkinson's. And this, of course, influences their decision-making and picking the, let's say, right drug or the right fit for the certain patient with the certain symptoms. And then I further went into paragraph 6, which I emphasized how important it is for patients to be actively involved in their care. And I think it's not just about patient being able to make a decision, but it's also by building trust that also their doctor is asking them questions and let's say trying to pull them into their treatment plan, not just making the decision for them. This builds like confidence for the patient. And lastly, I introduced primary and secondary aims, which were based, of course, on my research questions. So I restated the potential benefits, such as improved quality of life and better symptom control and stronger patient-practitioner communication to emphasize the study's importance. So why am I doing the study and why it's important to this reader group in a specific journal? And this is why we need to state these purposes and aims, what we are actually studying in the study. And here I just wanted to show an example of the first paragraph of my published study on the pharmacological management options. And as you can see, I started with the broader problem and importance. And later I will, of course, provide you with a link to the full published study. So if you're interested, then you can actually read it and maybe even use it as a template for a study that you are conducting. And of course, I cannot show all the paragraphs from the introduction, but here I also wanted to show the last paragraph of the introduction because, as said, stating the aims is very important. And this is the part that will lead you into the methodology because you're saying these are the aims and the methods will tell you how you are going to reach your aims for the study. And most studies, whether it is a survey or even an intervention involving any human subjects, will, as I already mentioned, require an ethics approval or an institutional review board approval. So in my paper, I started in the methods by reporting that the study was approved by the IRB board of the University of Jamestown, which is where I'm doing my PhD research. And this was not only a legal and ethical requirement, but it also builds trust with the readers of your paper and signals that the study follows standard research practices. For study design, as I already mentioned, I used the knowledge, attitude, practice, or CAP model as a framework for my questionnaire. So I did adapt it to my specific case, obviously, but I focused a lot on the knowledge part, which is why I didn't have, for example, as much as the attitude, or I didn't have at all the practice part. And again, as also mentioned, I try to include both closed-ended questions, such as participants picking which medications they know, as well as the other options for self-reported treatments. And that, of course, also helped to avoid this forced response bias. And for participants, I recruited two types. So as mentioned, patients with Parkinson's disease and healthcare practitioners. In my case, practitioners included not only doctors, such as neurologists, but also nurses, therapists, psychologists, physical therapists, and even caregivers. And recruitment was done through emails to global Parkinson's wellness programs and neurologists. And as I mentioned, also flyers with QR codes, which were hanged in hospitals and certain support group meetings. And a lot of it was, of course, done from word of mouth referral, meaning when I tell somebody and somebody does this survey and they decide to tell more people, which then again tell further people. And all my study materials clearly outline the purpose, benefits, and eligibility criteria. So the person who receives my email or sees the flyer is able to make a decision if they want to participate and if they're eligible to participate in my study. As for any instruments or measures, to determine how many participants I needed, I used the power analysis. But in this case, I didn't use the G-Power, but I used the power analysis tool in Qualtrics, which is the portal where I also made my survey and distributed it in. So it's similar to Google Forms, but it allows you to do more things with the questions. You can have different types of questions, even tables, and people can fill all of it out. So it's a really the best tool for survey research. And this, of course, estimated the 385 responses, but I ended up with 641. For procedures, the survey was available online through this portal known as Qualtrics, and of course, also in paper form. Then, as I said, it was translated to English, Latvian, and German. And since there was no existing validated CAP model in Latvian or German, there was only in English, then I used my native language proficiency and my German C1 certificate to ensure that I have accurate and understandable translations. And this was also proven to the IRB board, so they know how exactly I translated and if it's reliable. As also said, I include only fully completed surveys and I manually reviewed the data set, checking any inconsistencies. And of course, the data was stored anonymously and on a password protected computer. And as for the statistical tests, I also mentioned which ones I used. So I had descriptive statistics, I had the chi-square tests, everything that we spoke about last time in our last lecture. Also simple and multiple logistic regression. And of course, I looked at the p-value of less than 0.05 to determine significance for all my tests. So that's the usual threshold. And here is a long paragraph. I'm not going to read it out loud, but this is just an example of a paragraph from the methods, specifically the statistical analysis section. So since we talked about it last time, I thought it was important to put it in these slides. And I will make sure that you guys are provided with these slides as well, of course, as the link to my published paper. So if you want to see how this is written, but if you can already grasp, it's not that long of a paragraph if you really think about the amount of data analysis I did. So the point here is to actually stick to the important parts and write it in a language that is understandable to the reader, but it's also not overwhelming. So I just stated which statistical software I used. I described each statistical test and what it will study. I gave effect size ranges for interpreting the results. So this is also something that is important in the methodology. You need to make sure that you have some ranges and how you're interpreting these results. And you should have some reference for that. And most of the time, you're going to find it in other studies or in some certain articles that are published with these reference values. And I also had any reference factor variables that I used in my analysis for the sociodemographic variables. And of course, writing the results, very tough part, in my opinion, especially if you haven't done it before, because you have to present this huge amount of data in a clear and objective way. And you have to make sure you're not interpreting anything or discussing in the results. So you're just putting on paper what you analyze, so what it gave you, what you see. And I always begin with describing the sample, so giving my participant characteristics. Since I had 641 participants, 492 of them were patients and only 149 were practitioners. I also summarized their demographics, such as gender, ethnicity, age, education, employment status, and geographical location. And I showed them in table 1 of my manuscript. And I find tables a really nice way to present your results, additionally to the narrative that you're writing in the manuscript. I know that some readers don't even really read the narrative. They're going to skip straight to the table to see exactly. And that's kind of what I do when I look at clinical trial data. I often find the tables, and I'm not going to read every single result in the narrative, but I will very visually see it in the table, and I like that as well. And I also reported how many patients and practitioners were familiar then with each pharmacological management option, which also showed, of course, that levodopa-carbidopa was the most known, whereas procyclidine were least known. And I also made a bar graph out of that and showed it in figure 1. I will show it to you on later slide. And of course, I reported all the correlations that I had. I pointed out where the significant p-values are. And of course, I talked also about non-significant results. You don't only talk about the significant ones, you should also mention non-significant results. And of course, I think that it's important to always have these tables for reference and figures, as I already said, because it just gives you it gives the reader better understanding, but it also shows that you're able to present this data and your results in several ways. So you're not just able to write down what you ran in the statistical software, but you're also able to present it in a table or in a figure, which also requires, of course, additional thinking on how you're going to present it. Here is an example of one of my tables. This is table 2, which showed the results of the simple logistic regression. And I had a little bit of fight with this table in the beginning as well, because I wanted to see what's the best way to present this data that is understandable. As you can see, I just named the pharmacological options. I had to shorten the names of some of them, and then I included a legend because it would make the table look ugly and too long. And then I have the odds ratios with the 95% confidence interval. And as you can see, I identified it in the title. I wrote it's OR, odds ratio, and the brackets means that it's the 95% confidence interval. I also included these stars. So 1 star was if it was significant under 0.05. whereas 2 stars if it was significant under 0.01. And this is also something you will often see in research papers. And this is the figure 1 I was talking about. So this is how I chose to present the bar graph, which shows both patient and practitioner knowledge. So patients are in blue and practitioners are in gray. And here you can immediately identify that for all of the medications, practitioners were more knowledgeable. And this again shows you why this figure is so important, because without reading all the text, you can look at the figure and you can clearly identify that. And here I also try to make this type of curve to see which one is most known, which you can see is the levodopa carbidopa, and then it goes down to the least known. And then, of course, we come to the discussion. The discussion section can often be very frustrating. For me, it is the hardest part of the paper because it's the section where we make sense of the data. And it's about interpretation, context, and relevance. So if you're not allowed to do that in the results section, you do it in the discussion. You start to interpret, put in some context, and in my case, it would be clinical relevance. Depending on what type of research you're conducting, you're just saying why this is relevant. And I usually open the discussion with clear and confident statement of the key results, which in this case was that practitioners are significantly more knowledgeable than patients about most pharmacological management options. And this set the stage for all interpretations that followed. I further discussed the clinical risks of having this knowledge gap between patients and practitioners. I gave an example that if patients aren't aware of all available medications, especially alternatives to the levodopa, then it may lead to certain like symptom exacerbations or preventable side effects or even avoidable suffering. And these are serious implications for quality of life and clinical practice for patients, not only with Parkinson's disease. And of course, I focused a lot of the discussion on analyzing which sociodemographic variables were significantly associated with knowledge. So firstly, I talked about education because that was the most significantly associated. So it showed that those with higher education level were better informed, which is also consistent with health literacy literature. And of course, age also mattered, and younger people had more knowledge, and possibly it was due to technology. So this is things that I started mentioning, that what are the possibilities? So this is the interpretation. You start to interpret your results and you give ideas of why it could be that way. For some younger people also might be their recent training. For example, doctors, they are more fresh out of medical school, so they might be more knowledgeable of the recent treatments. And what was interesting is that I found geographic patterns. So Europeans knew more about certain drugs and North Americans about others. So there was that difference. And I think that it also reflects the differences in healthcare systems, guidelines, and of course, market access. And ethnicity and employment status were also influenced knowledge in ways that maybe weren't always predictable. And I think that this would warrant more research because unfortunately ethnicity was a little bit underrepresented, certain groups. Most of my sample was Caucasian, white, but certain populations were underrepresented. I did not have so many Hispanic participants or African American participants. And gender was not significantly associated with knowledge, which was important to report in my study, even though it was a null finding. And then I moved on to clinical consequences. So many patients with Parkinson's develop dysphagia, which is a problem with swallowing. And this makes oral medications unsafe for them because they can choke just because they cannot swallow the pill. And this is where a lot of alternative delivery methods, such as a pump that delivers straight into subcutaneous delivery or even IV delivery, would be much more safer. And then I proposed that education, communication, and assessment of patient health literacy should be central to clinical care, not only looking at the patient's symptoms or what the patient is telling you about their daily life, but actually trying to improve. Even if the patient comes and doesn't say that I think that I'm not knowledgeable enough of certain let's say, medication options, you should still try to educate the patient. And maybe even when you guys go to a doctor, sometimes the doctor hands you some booklet or tells you of a new option and gives you some material to read. So these are things that every doctor should be doing, every practitioner, also physical therapists, not just doctors. And I, of course, also suggested implementing a personalized care management model. I am a lot about personalized and individualized medicine because, as I said, every patient is different. And this is something that is worth also implementing in Parkinson's disease. We see a lot of it implemented in cancer care, but it should be done in every disease. And of course, I was transparent about limitations in my study. For example, not all practitioners in my sample could prescribe medications. So I looked at physical therapists, speech therapists, and others, and I did not collect data on which specific practitioner they are. So the practitioner just marked that they're a practitioner, but they did not tell me in a further question if they're a neurologist or a therapist or any other type of practitioner. So this is one limitation that I thought of too late when I had already started collecting my data. And of course, I had ethnicities and geographies underrepresented. So as I already mentioned, most of my sample was Caucasian white. And geographically wise, most of them were North American or European. So, for example, continents like Asia or South America were underrepresented. And the knowledge question was binary because I was collecting whether the patient or practitioner knows the medication or not. So it was kind of a yes or no answer. And I wasn't able to measure the depth or level of knowledge because I did not have any spectrum saying like from 1 to 10, where are you in knowing this medication? And of course, acknowledging these limitations strengthens the credibility of the paper because sometimes you might think that it's hard to judge yourself, but you have to do that in research because when they get to the limitations section, then they know that you don't think that your research paper is the best in the world and that you actually acknowledge that you did something wrong. And maybe in future research, either for research you will conduct or somebody who will learn from your study and will want to conduct a further study, then they can take these into account. And I closed the discussion by returning back to the big picture. So I said that there is a gap between what patients and practitioners know. And I said that this gap is influenced by sociodemographic factors. And this matters because knowledge affects patient autonomy and adherence and also patient safety, for example, in the case of the swallowing issues. And I said that future research should focus on communication quality, which can affect knowledge and outcomes. And lastly, is writing the conclusion. And you have to think that the conclusion of the paper isn't just a summary, but is where you emphasize what matters most and propose what will come next for a future study. So I repeated the main result again in the conclusion, and I identified and noted the sociodemographic variables such as the education, age, and geographic location, which play a major role in shaping the knowledge gap. And I again pointed out that this knowledge gap isn't just academic, but it has real clinical consequences for the patients. And I stressed that practitioners must adapt their communication based on patients' sociodemographic context. So in the conclusion, I gave like this last suggestion that I think is really important to start implementing in clinical practice in order to make sure that especially the patients are getting more knowledgeable of their management options. And I still closed completely by suggesting the direction for future research, which is examining patient-practitioner communication and how that shapes pharmacological knowledge. And this kind of ties into my next study, which I'm collecting data on right now, on shared decision-making and health equity. And it showed that these findings aren't the end, but it's actually a stepping stone for something that I'm going to research still in the future. And yes, that ends my research journey. So thank you for joining me and reflecting on this research journey. And here is the link to the published paper, and I will also put it in the chat for you afterwards. And if you have any questions at all about these lectures or anything else you would like to chat about, if it's about research, then you can always email me. I am available to answer your questions.